There is a kind of silence that falls over a room right before something irreversible happens. Not the silence of peace, the silence of a held breath. That silence fell over the Blackwater County Courthouse on a scorched July morning in 1873. In the second it took Judge Thomas Crane to lean forward on his bench, fold his ink-stained hands, and say the 6 words that would end his career. "If you win this case, I'll resign as judge." He said it the way a man throws a coin to a beggar carelessly, certain it would never be picked up, let alone spent. He said it in front of 200 witnesses, in front of the cattlemen who owed him favors and the railroad lawyers who owned his loyalty, in front of God and the dust and the flies buzzing lazily in the July heat. He said it to a 17-year-old girl in a patched cotton dress, standing alone at the defense table, because the man who was supposed to be standing there had been beaten half to death in an alley 2 nights before. Thomas Crane did not know in that moment that he was not looking at a frightened child he could bully back into her place. He was looking at the beginning of his own unraveling. He was looking at the one person in the entire territory with nothing left to lose, and everything left to prove. A girl who had already buried her father, already watched her mother's hands crack and bleed doing other people's laundry, already learned at 17 that the world does not hand out mercy, it has to be taken. By the time the dust settled over Blackwater 3 weeks later, the man who ran that courtroom like a private kingdom would be dragged out of it in iron cuffs. The railroad empire that thought it owned the valley would be shaking on its foundations, and the girl everyone had laughed at would be standing in the wreckage of it all, holding nothing but a brass compass and a promise she'd made to a dead man. This is the story of how she did it. This is the story of Clementine Boone. 3 days earlier, the Boone Ranch sat quiet under a bruised purple sky, the kind of dusk that made the wheat fields look like they were on fire without burning. Clementine stood at the kitchen window, watching her mother hang wet linens on a sagging line, her back bent in the particular way that comes from 20 years of labor that never once let up. Abigail Boone had not always stood like that. Clementine remembered a woman who used to laugh loud enough to startle the chickens, who used to dance her husband around the porch on Sunday evenings, when the fiddle music drifted up from the bunkhouse. That woman had been buried alongside John Boone 2 months ago, in a plot beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, and in her place stood someone thinner, quieter, and more afraid. "Mama, come sit." Clementine called softly. "The wash can wait until morning." "The wash cannot wait," Abigail said, without turning. "Nothing waits, Clement. Not the wash, not the mortgage, not men who want what isn't theirs." Clementine didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that, because it was true, and both of them knew it. 2 months, that was how long it had been since John Boone collapsed in the north pasture on a Tuesday morning, clutching his chest, and never rose again. The doctor had called it his heart, a weak valve. Years of hard labor finally catching up to a body that had given everything it had to a piece of land that never once gave anything back for free. Clementine had believed that explanation without question, the way a grieving daughter believes the simplest, kindest story. Because the alternative was too large and too frightening to hold, she would not believe it for much longer. But on this particular evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her grandfather's old law books stacked in front of her like a fortress wall, she still believed her father had simply died of a broken body and an unbroken will. What she did know, what she could not stop turning over in her mind like a stone in her palm, was that 10 days after they buried John Boone, a man in an expensive black coat had ridden up to the ranch house with a folded document and a satisfied little smile, and informed Abigail Boone that her husband had sold the ranch to the Cornwall Railroad Company 2 days before he died. Abigail had laughed at first, actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark, because it was such an obvious, clumsy lie. John Boone would never have sold that land. He'd have burned it to ash first. He'd told Clementine 100 times, sitting on the porch with his pipe, that the ranch was the one thing in this world he'd leave her free and clear, the one thing no railroad baron or land speculator would ever pry out of his family's hands while there was breath left in him. Except now there was no breath left in him, and there was a signature on a document that looked, at a careless glance, exactly like his. "They think because we're women, we'll just fold," Clementine said, closing the heavy law book in front of her. "They think because Papa is gone, there's no one left to fight." Abigail came inside finally, wiping her raw hands on her apron. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, at the sharp intelligence in those blue eyes, an intelligence that had always made Clementine seem older than her years. The kind of look John Boone used to say came straight down from her grandfather. "You are 17, Abigail said quietly. "You should be worrying about socials and Sunday dresses, not federal courtrooms. McFarland was going to handle it," Clementine reminded her. "He filed the objection. He gathered the witnesses. All I had to do was sit quietly at the table and let him do the talking." Abigail's face tightened at the mention of the name. 2 nights ago, their family's hired attorney, a decent, careful man, who had agreed to take the Boone case on credit because he genuinely believed, that the deed was a forgery, had been found in an alley behind the Mercantile, his jaw broken in 2 places, 3 ribs cracked, unable to speak, let alone stand in front of a judge. The sheriff had called it a robbery gone wrong. Nothing had been taken from McFarland's pockets. They broke that poor man's jaw to keep him quiet, Clementine said, her voice low and hard. "And now they think the case just dies with him, that there's no one left who understands the law well enough to stand up in that courtroom." "There isn't," Abigail said, and it was not cruelty in her voice. It was terror, plain and simple, the terror of a widow who had already lost one person she loved to that ranch and could not survive losing another. Clementine reached across the table and closed her hand around her mother's. "There is one person," she said. "Grandfather Boone commanded 400 men through the worst night of the war, on nothing but a compass and his own nerve. He taught me every page of these law books before I was 12 years old, because he said a mind sharp enough to read a battlefield is sharp enough to read a courtroom. I am not going to let a coward with a stolen signature take the only thing Papa left us." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the windmill. It was, Clementine would later think, the sound of the last ordinary night of her old life. She did not know yet that Judge Thomas Crane had once been Cornwall Railroad's chief legal architect. She did not know that the undertaker who buried her father was sitting on a piece of evidence that would blow the entire scheme wide open. She did not know that somewhere, in a locked office safe 2 miles away, a leather-bound ledger recorded her father's name in ink that had never dried honestly. All she knew, sitting at that kitchen table with the lamp burning low, was that tomorrow she would walk into a courtroom full of men who expected her to fail, and she intended to prove every single one of them wrong. The Blackwater County Courthouse had never held so many people at once, not even during the trial of the Denton brothers for cattle rustling 3 summers back. By 8 in the morning, every pew was full, and men were standing 3 deep along the back wall, hats in hand, sweat already soaking through their collars in the building heat. Word had traveled fast. A widow's daughter standing alone against the Cornwall Railroad Company because the family's real lawyer had been beaten senseless in an alley. It was the kind of story that emptied out the saloons and the Mercantile alike, because everyone in Blackwater understood, on some unspoken level, that this was not really about one ranch. It was about whether the railroad could do whatever it wanted to whoever it wanted, and no one would ever be able to stop it. Clementine walked through those double doors at 7:30, alone, carrying her grandfather's leather satchel, stuffed with law books that were older than she was. She had not slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her spine was straight, and she had pinned her hair back the exact way her mother did on Sundays, because looking presentable felt like the last piece of armor she had left. She sat down at the defense table and set her satchel beside her, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be looked at by 200 strangers, and found wanting before she had said a single word. The whispers started immediately. "That's her. The Boone girl can't be more than 17. Poor thing doesn't know what she's walked into." Clementine kept her eyes forward, on the empty bench, on the flag hanging limp in the windless heat, on anything but the rows of faces behind her. She thought of her grandfather, Colonel Thaddeus Boone, who had ridden through Confederate lines in the dead of a Virginia night to pull 400 trapped Union soldiers out of a collapsing position at Shenandoah. A man who had told her, more times than she could count, that fear was not the enemy. Fear was information. The only question was what you did with it. At the plaintiff's table, Elias Reed sat with the easy, satisfied posture of a man who had already won. He was perhaps 35, dressed in a silk vest that had never seen a day of honest ranch work, his boots polished to a mirror shine that looked almost insulting against the dusty floorboards. He did not so much as glance at Clementine. Why would he? To men like Elias Reed, she was not an opponent. She was an inconvenience, a delay of perhaps 20 minutes before the paperwork was finalized and he could catch the afternoon train back east. Then the side door opened, and Judge Thomas Crane entered. He moved the way powerful men often do, unhurried, certain that the room would wait for him because it always had. He was somewhere past 50, silver-bearded, built like a man who had once done real labor and had long since traded it for a leather chair and a gavel. He settled onto the bench with a heavy, satisfied exhale and let his gaze drift across the packed gallery before finally, deliberately, landing on Clementine. Something flickered across his face. Not concern, amusement. Well, Crane said, and the room quieted instantly to hear him. It appears Mr. McFarland has had an unfortunate accident, and in his place, we have. He consulted a paper in front of him with theatrical slowness. Miss Clementine Boone, 17 years of age. A ripple of laughter moved through the gallery. Clementine did not move. Miss Boone, Crane went on, leaning back in his chair. I want to be certain you understand the gravity of what you are attempting today. This is not a schoolroom debate. This is a federal land dispute involving one of the largest railroad concerns in this territory. Do you understand the difference? I do, Your Honor. He said it flatly, not as a question. His eyes swept the gallery, gathering their attention like a performer gathers a crowd before the trick. Then let me be plain with you, for your own good, and for the good of this court's time. He leaned forward. If you win this case, I'll resign as judge. The room went utterly silent, and then erupted gasps, low whistles, someone in the back laughing outright. Clementine felt the words land in her chest like a physical blow, though she could not yet say whether it was the blow of an insult or the sudden, dizzying scent of an opportunity. Crane raised a hand, and the room quieted again, hungry for more. I make that offer, he continued, because I do not believe for one moment that you can win it. But if you do lose, and you and your mother will pack your wagons and be gone from this territory by sundown. No appeals, no delays. You will accept the court's ruling and leave Blackwater for good. He allowed himself a small, cold smile. You might want to reconsider whether a little girl belongs in a court of law. The laughter that followed was uglier this time, less surprised and more cruel. The laughter of men enjoying a public whipping. At the plaintiff's table, Elias Reed smiled behind his hand. Clementine felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She could still ask for a delay. No one in Blackwater would blame her. Everyone understood their attorney had been attacked. Everyone understood a girl of 17 had no business standing where she stood. She could walk out those doors right now with her dignity mostly intact, find another lawyer in the county seat, by herself weeks, maybe months. But she thought of her mother's hands, cracked and bleeding in the wash water. She thought of the ranch hands, old Ezric, young Tobias, the Whitfield brothers, who had pooled together 3 months' wages they could not spare, to buy her grandfather's law books back from the estate sale after her grandfather passed, because they believed, without ever quite saying it aloud, that someone from their side of the valley deserved the chance to read law the same as any wealthy man's son. She thought of her father, 20 years, bent over that unforgiving soil, turning rock and drought into something that could be called a home. If she folded now, she would not just be failing herself. Clementine lifted her chin. I am prepared to proceed, Your Honor. The words landed harder than Crane had expected. His smile thinned. Know what? He asked, almost reflexively, as though he'd misheard. No delay, Clementine said, her voice steady enough now to carry to the back wall. I am prepared to proceed. For just a moment so brief that only someone watching very closely would have caught it. Something crossed Judge Crane's face that was not amusement at all. It was surprise, and beneath the surprise, so fleeting it might have been imagined, something that looked almost like unease. Then it was gone, buried under the same tight, venomous smile. Very well, Miss Boone, Crane said. Then let us begin. Clementine sat down, gripping the edge of the table to keep her hands from shaking, and reached into her apron pocket to close her fingers around the cool brass of her grandfather's compass. True north isn't a direction, he used to tell her. It's a choice you make before the storm hits, so you don't have to make it during. She had made her choice. Now she would have to live inside it. Elias Reed rose first, and he did so with the loose, theatrical confidence of a man performing for an audience, rather than arguing for a verdict. He paced the creaking floorboards in front of the jury box, though there was no jury today, only Judge Crane's ruling, to shape the record for whatever appeal or dismissal would follow, and laid out the plaintiff's case with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who had done this 100 times in 100 towns, just like Blackwater. The facts, Your Honor, are not in dispute. Reed said, on the 12th of May of this year, John Boone signed a deed transferring ownership of the property known as the Boone Ranch to the Cornwall Railroad Company in exchange for fair and documented compensation. That deed bears his signature, witnessed and notarized in the proper form. The defense's claim to the land is, quite simply, baseless, a grieving family's understandable but legally irrelevant refusal to accept a lawful transaction. He gestured, almost sympathetically, toward Clementine. I take no pleasure in saying this to a young woman who has clearly suffered a great loss. But sentiment is not law, and this court cannot allow sentiment to override a signed and witnessed contract. He returned to his seat, looking thoroughly satisfied with himself. Crane turned his heavy gaze onto Clementine. Your turn, Miss Boone. She stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she rose. She let them, because hiding it would have cost her energy she needed elsewhere, and she reached into her apron pocket one more time to feel the compass before stepping around the table. Your Honor, she began, this case is not about a simple land dispute. It is about correcting a lie. The room quieted in a different way. Now not the mocking hush of before, but something sharper, more attentively. Outside, faintly, the stamp of horses in the dirt street carried through the open window. My father, John Boone, died on the 10th of May, Clementine said, her voice steady and clear, pitched to carry to every corner of the room. Yet the deed the plaintiff has entered into evidence claims he signed his ranch away on the 12th of May, 2 days after his death. Reed shot to his feet. Objection. The girl is inventing dates to earn the court's sympathy. Sit down. Reed. Crane snapped, and the sharpness of it seemed to surprise even Crane himself. Reed blinked, clearly startled, and lowered himself slowly back into his chair. Clementine pressed forward before the moment could slip away from her. The railroad wants this court to believe that my father rose from his grave to sign a piece of paper, she said. But Your Honor, a dead man cannot hold a pen. She lifted a heavy, worn ledger from the table and held it up so the gallery could see its cracked leather spine. This is the town undertaker's burial ledger. It records my father's burial on the 10th of May. It bears the signature of Mr. Obadiah Finch, the undertaker, and it is witnessed by Dr. Samuel Reese, this town's physician. She let that settle for a beat. This ledger was never disclosed to my family. It was never entered into the court record. It appears to have simply disappeared until I found it myself yesterday evening. The room broke into murmurs. Cowboys along the back wall leaned forward. Reed shot up again, his composure cracking for the first time. Objection. That ledger is not properly filed before this court. It was lost, Clementine said, turning to face him directly, her voice hardening. No, it was buried, because someone in this town wanted it to stay buried. Judge Crane's expression shifted. It lasted only a fraction of a second. The way a shadow crosses a wall and is gone before the eye can be certain it was ever there. But Clementine, watching him with the same focused attention her grandfather had taught her to use, scanning a battlefield map, saw it clearly. Fear. Crane struck his gavel hard enough that the sound cracked through the rafters. This court will recess until tomorrow morning, pending review of this new evidence. Gasps spread through the sweltering room. People surged to their feet all at once, the heat and the shock breaking the room's discipline entirely. Two men Clementine recognized as reporters from the territorial paper shoved their way toward the double door, already composing the story in their heads. Reed gathered his papers with visibly unsteady hands, his earlier smoothness gone entirely. Judge Crane rose from the bench without another word and disappeared into his chambers, his heavy step noticeably quicker than the one that had carried him in. Clementine sat back down slowly, her breath coming unevenly, her hands still trembling, but the compass in her pocket felt warm against her palm, as though it had absorbed some of her grandfather's old steadiness and was returning it to her now, drop by drop. An older man with a silver mustache and a faded Texas Ranger star pinned crookedly to a weathered leather vest made his way toward her table as the room slowly emptied. Hosea Brooks had been her grandfather's closest friend for the better part of 30 years, a man who had ridden with Colonel Boone during the war and had never quite stopped riding since. He stopped beside her chair, removing his dusty Stetson. You know what just happened in here? Hosea asked. Clementine shook her head, still catching her breath. The judge panicked. That he did. Hosea's pale eyes drifted toward the empty bench, narrowing slightly. You scared him, girl? The judge. Clementine frowned. He's twice my size and holds the whole territory's law in his hands. What could I possibly have scared him with? Hosea leaned against the wooden railing separating the gallery from the well of the court, lowering his voice so only she could hear. He didn't challenge you because he thought you were weak, he said. Powerful men don't make public spectacles out of things they're certain of. They only do that when they're trying to convince a room and themselves of something they're not sure is true. He tapped the brim of his hat against his palm. Thoughtfully, he challenged you, because some part of him is afraid you might actually win. Clementine looked toward the empty bench, then down at the undertaker's ledger still resting beneath her hand, its cracked leather cover warm from the July heat and her own nervous grip. For the first time, she understood Judge Thomas Crane had not tried to humiliate her in front of the whole town because he believed she would lose easily. He had tried to humiliate her because some part of him already suspected she might not. Clementine did not leave the courthouse with the rest of the town, while the crowd spilled out into the street to trade rumors and speculation. She stayed behind in the small, airless conference room beside the main hall. The undertaker's ledger spread open across a scarred pine table under the hiss of a kerosene lamp. The adrenaline that had carried her through the hearing was draining out of her now. All at once, the way floodwater recedes and leaves the wreckage behind in plain view, her hands had finally stopped shaking, but a hollow, exhausted ache had settled into her chest instead. Hosea closed the heavy door behind him, muting the noise of the street outside, and pulled up a chair across from her without waiting to be invited. You understand what this means now? He asked. That Judge Crane panicked, Clementine said, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Hosea shook his head slowly. Judges don't panic over routine paperwork. They rule on forged deeds every week of the year and go home to a fine supper without losing a wink of sleep over it. Crane didn't panic because a piece of evidence surprised him. He rested his weathered hands flat on the table, leaning into. He panicked because that ledger should never have existed in your file at all. It was supposed to be burned. The words settled into the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward long after the splash itself had gone silent. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with sudden, unbearable loudness. What are you saying? Hosea, I'm saying someone hid that evidence months ago, Hosea said gently, watching her face carefully as the meaning worked its way through her. And if Crane reacted like a spooked horse the second he laid eyes on it, there's a mighty good chance he knows exactly why it was hidden in the first place. Clementine felt her stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. You think he was involved in stealing the ranch? Hosea said nothing. He didn't need to. Clementine leaned back slowly in her chair, staring at the lamp flame without truly seeing it. The possibility had already begun forming somewhere in the back of her mind during the hearing itself. A shape she hadn't been ready to look at directly. Hearing it spoken aloud in Hosea's flat, certain voices made it suddenly unbearably real. Judge Thomas Crane was not merely biased against a grieving family fighting a railroad company. He might be personally, directly connected to the forgery of her father's signature. Hosea folded his arms across his chest. If that's true, Clement, this stops being a simple courtroom fight. It becomes something a great deal bigger. You'd be taking on the men who actually run this frontier, not just one crooked judge in one dusty town, but the whole machine behind him. Clementine looked at him, and something of her grandfather's old steel crept into her eyes. The same look John Boone used to say skipped a generation and landed square in his daughter's daughter. Then we prove it. Hosea studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, a smile spread beneath his silver mustache. Good answer. He reached into his dusty saddlebag and slid a thick stack of tied papers across the table toward her. Original County Land Archive records, he said. I pulled them from the record office this afternoon, while the clerk stepped out for his lunch. Man's been eating the same overcooked mutton at the same hour for 11 years running. You could set a pocket watch by him. I figured we'd need these before somebody decided it was time to make them disappear. Clementine carefully untied the string binding the stack together. Inside were land grants going back a decade, sheriff's reports, tax assessments, old property filings scattered across half the valley. The kind of dry, exhausting paperwork most men would never bother to read twice. Hosea stood, settling his hat back onto his head. You've got until tomorrow morning before Crane finds his nerve again, and takes back control of that courtroom. He said, if there's a thread connecting him to the railroad's theft, find it tonight. He gave her a respectful nod and stepped out into the hall, leaving her alone with the lamp and the papers and the ticking clock. Clementine spent the next 4 hours moving through the files, page by page, methodically, the way her grandfather had taught her to read a map before a night march, never skimming, never assuming, because the detail you skip past is always the one that matters. The room grew dark around her as the kerosene lamp burned lower, casting long, restless shadows across the walls. At first, it was ordinary frontier paperwork, property lines, cattle counts, routine filings that told her nothing except how thoroughly boring most of the law truly was. Then she found it, a foreclosure order on a neighboring ranch, the old Hargrove place, a family that had quietly packed up and left the valley 18 months back. A departure Clementine remembered only vaguely as a sad but unremarkable piece of town gossip. The order was dated just 6 days before her father died. The signature at the bottom read, Thomas Crane, Chief Attorney, Cornwall Railroad Company. Clementine went still. Her pulse quickened until she could feel it in her ears. Crane had not always been a judge. Before he'd ever worn the black robe, he had been the lead attorney for the very railroad company, now trying to steal her family's land. A man who had personally signed the orders pushing local families out of the valley, one foreclosure at a time. Long before he'd ever sat behind a bench pretending to be neutral, she flipped through the next pages faster now, her fingers trembling with something that was no longer exhaustion. Another memo bearing his signature, then another, each one connecting him more deeply, more undeniably, to Cornwall's methodical land grab across the valley. Hosea had been right. Crane was not presiding over this hearing as a disinterested judge weighing the facts. He was sitting in judgment over a theft he had very likely helped design from the very beginning, and now he was simply protecting his own handiwork from the daughter of a man he had helped destroy. Clementine grabbed a blank telegraph form from the corner of the desk and half ran through the dark, empty street to the telegraph office, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust in the moonlight. She paid the sleepy night operator to send an urgent message to Hosea at the saloon, where he was keeping watch. I found everything, she wrote. Crane worked for Cornwall. 10 minutes later, Hosea found her standing outside the telegraph office, the paperwork clutched tight against her chest. He looked at the stack of documents in her hands and exhaled a long, heavy breath into the cool night air. God help him, Hosea murmured, because after tomorrow, nothing in this territory is going to be the same. The next morning, the Blackwater courthouse was fuller than it had been the day before, if such a thing were possible. Word had traveled through the saloons and boarding houses overnight like brush fire in dry grass. People were no longer coming to watch a young girl fail, they were coming to see what happened next. Judge Crane entered from his chambers with his usual heavy, deliberate step, but Clementine noticed it immediately, the small, telling cracks in his composure that hadn't been there the day before. The skin beneath his eyes was dark and puffy, the look of a man who had not slept. His movements were sharper, more alert, almost brittle. The careful control of someone walking across thin ice and trying very hard not to let anyone see him listening for the crack beneath his boots. He knew the stakes now. Elias Reed rose the moment proceedings began, smoothing the front of his expensive silk vest with visibly practiced calm. Your Honor, before we continue this frontier circus, he said, the Cornwall Railroad Company moves to strike yesterday's submission in its entirety. Furthermore, we request sanctions against the defense for introducing improper and prejudicial material without proper filing. Crane looked down at Clementine. Response, Miss Boone. She stood. The railroad wishes to strike the ledger, Your Honor, because they cannot explain how it came to be missing from the court record in the first place. Objection, Reed barked. Overruled. Crane said it instantly, almost too quickly, plainly performing fairness for the packed gallery, rather than feeling any genuine obligation toward it. Clementine pressed forward, her voice carrying clean across the wooden hole. Furthermore, Your Honor, the defense formally requests disclosure of all Cornwall Railroad legal personnel involved in the original acquisition of the Boone property. Specifically, we request to know whether any sitting member of this court participated in those original decisions. The change in Crane's face was small, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, but the entire gallery saw it. Reed rose immediately. Objection, relevance. Clementine did not so much as glance at Reed. Her eyes stayed locked on the bench. It goes directly to our claim that evidence was deliberately suppressed by men with a vested personal interest in this railroad's success. Crane's jaw tightened visibly beneath his gray beard. He held her gaze for 3 long, silent seconds before answering. Denied. The room stirred, a low ripple of muttering cowboys and shifting boots. Clementine let it settle before speaking again. Her voice pitched deliberately for the court record. Then let the record reflect that this court has denied disclosure of the railroad's legal involvement in the alleged suppression of evidence. Crane's eyes narrowed to dark, furious slits. Noted. Miss Boo. Behind her, seated in the front pew, Hosea leaned forward just slightly. He's rattled, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. Reed resumed his argument, but his rhythm had gone off entirely. The arrogant fluidity of the previous day replaced by something tighter, more defensive. He was no longer simply defending a land claim. He was protecting a secret, and everyone in that room, whether they understood the details or not, could feel the shift in the air. The hearing dragged on through another grueling hour. Every time Clementine pushed toward the railroad's past conduct, Crane shut her down faster than before. Every ruling favored Reed. Every railroad objection was sustained without hesitation. Every attempt she made to broaden discovery of the old deeds was denied outright. The judge's patience visibly fraying with each request. During a brief recess, while Crane reviewed a document at the bench, a young man in a plain gray suit slipped along the side wall of the courtroom and knelt briefly beside the defense table, pretending to retrieve a dropped pencil. He was perhaps 22, sandy-haired, with the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent his days buried in paperwork rather than saddles. Miss Boone, he whispered, barely moving his lips. I clerk for the county recorder's office. I filed papers for Cornwall Railroad for 2 years, before I couldn't stomach it anymore. He pressed a small, folded scrap of paper into her palm beneath the table's edge. Look at Ridgeview. Ask for Levi Morgan, and burn this note the second you've read it. Before Clementine could respond, he was gone, melting back into the crowd along the wall as though he had never been there at all. She unfolded the note beneath the table, shielding it with her skirt. 2 words, hastily scrawled. He knows. Hosea leaned close as court resumed its tedious grind. Who was that? He murmured. I don't know his name, Clementine whispered back, but I think we just found a friend inside the machine. She tucked the note into her sleeve, her mind already racing ahead to Ridgeview, to a name she'd never heard before this morning. Levi Morgan, and to the growing, certain feeling that the walls Judge Thomas Crane had built around himself were not nearly as solid as he believed them to be. That afternoon, Clementine left the stifling courthouse the moment the gavel called recess, and walked straight to the county archives, the clerk's whispered note still burning against her wrist like a brand. She requested the employee records for the Cornwall Railroad Company, specifically for the year her father had died. The nervous young clerk behind the counter, not the sympathetic one from the courtroom, but an older, twitchier man with ink-stained cuffs, resisted at first, citing company privacy and proper procedure, and a dozen other small bureaucratic walls men like him hid behind when they didn't want trouble. Clementine persisted. She placed a silver dollar on the counter, followed by a second, and finally a third, and watched the man's resolve crumble along with his objections. 2 hours later, she had what she needed spread across a borrowed table in a back records room. Employment rosters, surveying logs, legal assignment records, each one bearing the same signature, over and over, until the name stopped looking like a name at all and started looking like a confession. Thomas Crane had not been some minor functionary in Cornwall's operation. He had been the company's chief legal architect for its entire expansion through the valley. The man who drafted the very contracts now being used to force families off land their grandparents had bled to claim. He had not simply looked the other way while Cornwall stole from people like the Boones and the Hargroves. He had built the machinery that made the theft possible, page by careful page, clause by careful clause. Clementine stared at the yellowed paper until her eyes burned, her mouth gone dry as chalk dust. This was no longer merely a stolen ranch, no longer a simple matter of one greedy judge protecting his own reputation. The man trying to destroy her family was not defending the law, he was defending himself and everything he had built beneath a black robe that had never once made him honest. She found Hosea outside the livery stable as the sun began its long slide toward the western ridgeline, painting the sky in the same bruised purple as the evening her father's fate had first been called into question. He wasn't just involved, Clementine said,
her voice dropping low.
He wrote the contracts.
Hosea,
He built this.
Hosea went very still, an apple half raised toward his horse's waiting muzzle.
Then that means, if your father's deed is proven a forgery, he said slowly. Crane goes down with the railroad. There's no separating them. Not anymore. Yes, Clementine finished.
That night,
She sat alone at the kitchen table of the small ranch house, working by the light of a single oil lamp until nearly midnight,
organizing every record,
every foreclosure notice, every surveying lodge, every signature into an order that would tell a story no honest jury could ignore. Her mother came down the narrow staircase sometime past 11,
a woolen shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders against the night chill,
and stopped in the doorway at the sight of the papers spread across every inch of the table, like a battlefield map.
Clementine, Abigail said softly, "We need to talk."
Clementine looked up, rubbing her tired eyes. I'm almost finished.
Mama.
Abigail sat down across from her anyway, her rough, work-worn hands folded in front of her,
her eyes carrying a kind of fear Clementine had not seen in them since the week after John Boone's funeral. McFarland sent word through the doctor's office, she said.
He's well enough now to speak a little, and what he said troubles me deeply.
He says we should drop the case.
Clementine stared at her mother, disbelief cracking through her exhaustion.
Drop it, after what they did to him.
He says you are accusing a sitting federal judge of corruption.
Clement, openly, in a room full of witnesses.
He says that kind of accusation brings dangerous men to our door. Men far more dangerous than a broken jaw in an alley. Abigail's voice trembled. He says we should accept the small settlement the railroad has offered and move on before something worse happens to one of us. Clementine stood up so quickly her chair scraped hard against the floorboards. A man forged Papa's name.
Mama,
they stole our home out from under us while his body was still warm in the ground.
And if I go after Crane directly, we might actually win.
And if you miss,
Abigail said, her voice breaking, we lose our lives instead of just our land.
She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand in both of hers,
gripping it tight.
This frontier rewards survival,
Clementine,
not righteousness. Learn that lesson before it costs you everything. Clementine stood alone in the kitchen long after her mother had gone back upstairs,
the lamp flame guttering low,
her chest tight with a fury she did not fully know how to hold. Hosea arrived at the house minutes later,
having heard the news traveling through town almost as fast as it had left McFarland's sickbed.
He stepped inside,
shaking the night chill from his coat.
Your mother wants you to stop,
he said,
without preamble. She's scared,
Clementine answered, sinking back into her chair.
Hosea looked at the files spread before her,
then back at her face. Are you going to stop?
Clementine thought of her father of 20 years spent, breaking his back to turn rocky, unforgiving soil into something that could be called a home. She thought of Crane looking down at her from his high bench, as though she were nothing more than dirt on the sole of his boot.
Now, she said. Hosea nodded slowly, something like grim pride settling into the lines of his weathered face.
Good, he said, because tomorrow, this stops being about winning a piece of land.
He met her eyes squarely.
It becomes about exposing a machine,
and machines do not go quietly.
Clementine looked down at the stack of evidence in front of her,
at Crane's name appearing over and over across the ledgers like a stain that would not wash out no matter how many times the water was changed.
She understood fully and finally the truth of what lay ahead of her.
The most dangerous man in that courtroom had never been Elias Reed. It had always been the judge himself. I need a witness, she said.
Someone who was actually there when Crane forged the deeds.
Paper alone won't be enough to hang a sitting judge. Hosea, I need a voice.
Hosea tapped a finger thoughtfully against one of the surveying logs spread across the table.
Most of the Cornwall men from that time have scattered west,
or died, or simply vanished, the way men like that tend to when the money dries up.
But there's one name I keep seeing here, over and over. He turned the log toward her, pointing at a signature line. Levi Morgan, head surveyor for Cornwall's Valley operation. Man knows every inch of ground they ever touched, and likely every lie they ever told about it. Where do I find him? Out near Ridgeview, Hosea said. Lives alone, keeps to himself these days. Clementine was already reaching for her heavy wool coat. I'm going to take your grandfather's rifle, Hosea warned, following her toward the door, and ride fast. If that clerk in the courtroom was willing to risk his position to send you toward this man, you can be sure others already know his name too, and they won't want you reaching him first.
40 minutes of hard riding brought Clementine to a secluded log cabin, tucked into the foothills west of Ridgeview,
the wind howling through the surrounding pines with a sound like something grieving. She dismounted, tied her horse to a lodgepole fence post with fingers stiff from the cold, and knocked hard on the heavy cabin door. An older man opened it, a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Suspicion carved deep into the lines of his weathered face. His gray hair whipped loose in the wind. Levi Morgan, Clementine asked. Who's asking? And why in the hell are you out here alone this time of night? My name is Clementine Boone. I'm defending my father's ranch in court against the Cornwall Railroad. Morgan's expression changed instantly, not softening, but hardening into something closer to fear. He began to shut the door. Clementine drove her boot against the frame, stopping it. Please, she said quickly. I only need 5 minutes. I have nothing to say about the Boone Ranch, Morgan said, his voice tight. You surveyed our land. Clementine pressed, refusing to let the door close. And you know my father never signed that deed. Morgan's eyes darted toward the dark tree line behind her, a flash of pure, reflexive fear. Watch yourself, girl. You don't know who might be listening out here. Did you know the undertaker's ledger was buried? Clementine asked, stepping closer despite the revolver still loosely aimed in her direction. Or did Thomas Crane hide that from you too? The same way he hid everything else. That stopped him only for a moment, but the moment told her everything she needed to know. You didn't know, Clementine said quietly. Morgan lowered the revolver slightly, his jaw working beneath his gray stubble. You need to leave, he said, though the conviction had gone out of his voice. You don't understand what kind of men you're hunting. I know they let my father die and stole his legacy while his body was still warm, Clementine said. Help me understand the rest of it. Morgan stared at her for a long, silent moments, the wind whipping at his hair, and then, finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider. 5 minutes, he said. Then you ride home and forget you ever found this cabin. He sat heavily in a rocking chair beside the hearth and folded his arms, staring into the low fire, rather than at her. I surveyed your land myself. Back in the spring, he said. Best water access anywhere in the valley, a spring-fed creek that never ran dry even in the worst drought years. Cornwall needed that water desperately for the new rail line. Your father refused to sell. Refused flat out, more than once, even when they came back with better offers each time. So they forced him, Clementine said, sitting opposite him on a low wooden stool. No, Morgan said, his voice going darker. Crane drafted a fake deed instead. Told me personally that the railroad had reached a private arrangement with John Boone, one your father supposedly wanted kept quiet from his own family for tax reasons. I believed him. He was quiet a moment. Or maybe I simply chose to because it was easier than asking the questions I already half knew the answers to. What about the ledger? Morgan's gaze stayed fixed on the fire. 3 days before the railroad filed that deed, the undertaker came to Crane's office. Man was troubled, said he had proof your father was already 2 days dead before the ink on that signature was ever dry. I was in the outer room when he came in. I saw Crane take that ledger straight out of his hand. Clementine's heart pounded against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. You saw him take it. He said he'd handle the paperwork personally. Told the undertaker it was a clerical mix-up that needed sorting quietly to avoid embarrassing your family further. Morgan's mouth twisted with old, buried shame. Then I watched him lock it in his office safe with his own hand. Who else knew? Morgan hesitated, and for a moment Clementine feared he would stop there entirely. Just one other man, he said finally. The railroad's regional manager, Arthur Vance. Clementine pulled a stub of charcoal from her coat pocket and wrote the name directly onto the back of her own hand, not trusting herself to remember it clearly through the fog of everything she was learning tonight. Where do I find him? Retired now. Lives in a brick mansion over in St. Denis. The kind of house built on land other men used to own. Morgan stood abruptly, moving to the small window and glancing out into the dark, as though the mention of Vance's name alone might summon something out of the trees. Morgan, Clementine said, rising as well. There's something else I need to ask you. Something about the manner of my father's death. Morgan went very still, his back to her. The doctor said his heart simply gave out. Clementine continued, her voice carefully leveled despite the tremor beneath it. But he was a strong man. Morgan, 20 years of hard labor never once slowed him, and he died 6 days after Crane signed that foreclosure order on the Hargrove place the same week Cornwall needed my father's water rights more desperately than they'd ever needed anything in this valley. She swallowed hard, Did you ever hear anything, a name, a rumor, anything at all about a man Cornwall used when persuasion alone wasn't enough? Morgan's shoulders tightened visibly, and for a long, terrible moment Clementine thought he would refuse to answer at all. Then, without turning around, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. There was a man who did quiet work for the company. Went by Silas Crow. I never saw him do anything myself. Understand, I want that clear. But I heard things, whispers among the surveying crews about families who refused to sell, and then, within a week or two, suddenly stopped refusing. One way or another, he finally turned to face her, and his eyes were haunted in the firelight. I don't know what happened to your father, Miss Boo. God help me. I don't, but I know Crow was seen in this valley the week your father died, and I know that is not something I have ever been able to make my peace with. The cabin seemed to grow colder around her. Clementine felt the floor of her own certainty shift beneath her feet, the last 2 months of grief suddenly reshaping itself into something with sharper, more terrible edges. Would you testify to what you just told me? She asked quietly. About the ledger, about Crane, about all of it. Morgan laughed, bitter and humorless. You think I have a death wish? Little girl, I think you let an innocent man's family lose everything, and it's been eating you alive ever since. Clementine said, meeting his eyes without flinching. I think that's why you're telling me any of this at all, when you could have simply left me standing out in the cold. That landed. Morgan looked away, his shoulders slumping under some invisible weight he'd clearly been carrying a long time. I've thought about John Boone every single day since it happened, he admitted quietly. Clementine stepped toward the door, her hands steady now on the frame. Then testify, she said. If Crane goes to federal prison, he can't hurt you or anyone else from behind iron bars. Neither can Vance. Once the truth about Silas Crow comes out alongside everything else. Morgan stared at the floorboards for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. One statement, he said, under oath. I'll ride into town tomorrow morning and swear to every word of it. Clementine left the cabin with a fierce, fragile hope burning in her chest for the first time since this nightmare had begun. She had a direct witness now. A man who could place Crane's own hands on the buried ledger, and whose whispered fear pointed toward something far darker than a stolen signature. She rode hard back toward Blackwater beneath a sky thick with cold stars, the night air biting at her cheeks. A single name burning itself into her memory alongside all the others. Silas Crow. Clementine returned to the small boarding house room in town, where she and her mother had been staying since the trial began, her mind still racing with everything Levi Morgan had told her, a plan already half formed for how she would present it come morning. The moment she pushed open the heavy oak door, she knew something was terribly wrong. The room had been torn apart, mattresses lay sliced open, feathers scattered across the floor like dirty snow. Drawers had been yanked out and dumped, their contents strewn everywhere. Her grandfather's law books, the same books the ranch hands had scraped together their wages to buy her, had been hurled against the far wall, hard enough to crack their spines. Pages bent and torn. Her stomach dropped. She ran to the small writing desk in the corner where she had kept her backup case materials. A second set of copies she'd made specifically in case something like this happened. Gone. Every copied surveying log, every court note, every procedural filing gone. Only one thing remained, resting deliberately in the center of the desk's scarred wood surface. A single sheet of thick, expensive parchment, the kind of paper that cost more than most ranch hands made in a week. No signature, no fingerprints she could see by lamplight. Just 6 words, written in elegant, unhurried ink. Drop the case while you can. Clementine stared at the note for a long moment, her hands beginning to shake, not from fear this time, but from a sudden, blinding fury that burned through the exhaustion of the last 2 days like a match through dry paper. Because now, there could be no doubt left at all. This was no longer merely a matter of one corrupt judge protecting his own reputation, or even a company protecting its profits. This was a machine, and it had finally shown her its teeth. She grabbed the note and ran back out into the dark street, her boots slapping against the boardwalk, until she found Hosea at the saloon nursing a slow whiskey and watching the door out of old habit. She said the only words that mattered. They're scared. Hosea arrived at the boarding house in under 5 minutes, his coat still half-buttoned. He stepped inside, stopped cold, and surveyed the destruction in total. Grim silence, the sliced mattress, the empty desk, the ruined books. He turned slowly to face her. Did they take anything valuable? He asked, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his revolver. Clementine held up the parchment note.
Only the case materials. Hosea read it once,
his weathered face darkening like a gathering thundercloud. They're escalating, he said quietly. They broke into my room. Hosea tore apart everything I own. I know they stole our evidence. I know that too. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low and steady. The voice he must have used calming spooked horses and green recruits alike over 30 years of hard living. And that means you are right over the target. Clement, powerful men do not break into a widow's boarding house room over a case they consider weak. Clementine looked around at the ruin of her belongings and found that her anger had burned straight through whatever fear might otherwise have taken root there. This proves a conspiracy, she said. Now, Hosea said grimly, it proves desperation, which is useful to know, but it isn't admissible in a court of law, and it won't do a thing to help Morgan's testimony hold up under Reed's cross-examination tomorrow. He paused. There's something else you should know before you decide what happens next. Clementine went still, some instinct warning her that whatever came next would not be good news. What? I rode past the telegraph office on my way here. Hosea said there was a wire waiting from a contact of mine down in St. Denis. He hesitated, and for the first time since she'd known him, Hosea Brooks looked genuinely uneasy. Arthur Vance left his estate 2 hours ago. He's riding for Blackwater, ought to arrive by first light. Clementine felt something cold settle into her chest. He's coming here himself, which means, Hosea said slowly, he's decided this has gone far enough that he can't trust Crane or Reed to handle it alone anymore. He looked at her directly. So what now? Clementine exhaled sharply, her breath pluming visibly in the cold night air of the ruined room. So what now? She repeated. Now we stop pretending this is only a legal fight, Hosea said. We lock the doors, we load the rifles, and tomorrow morning we take the war directly to the judge's bench before Vance has the chance to bury Morgan's courage the way they buried that ledger. Dawn broke over Blackwater, painting the dusty streets in shades of blood orange and pale gold, the air biting and cold in the way only high desert mornings could be. Clementine and Hosea stood outside the heavy courthouse doors, watching the road leading out toward Ridgeview, waiting for Levi Morgan to arrive and swear his testimony before the court convened. He was their silver bullet. Everything now depended on him standing in that courtroom and saying, under oath, what he had told Clementine by firelight the night before. At 7 o'clock, a horse trotted into view at the edge of town. But Morgan was not alone. He rode flanked by 3 men on horseback, dressed in dark dusters and low bowler hats, hired guns, the unmistakable look of Pinkerton men, the kind of hired muscle only deep railroad money could afford. Behind them rolled a polished black carriage, its brass fittings catching the early light. Morgan looked terrified. His face was pale as bone, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed somewhere on his own saddle horn, rather than anywhere near the courthouse steps. When he passed close enough to see Clementine waiting there, he did not stop, he did not even slow. He rode straight through town, and out the far side, the 3 Pinkertons matching his pace exactly, herding him along like cattle being moved off contested grass. Morgan, Clementine called out, stepping down off the boardwalk into the street. Morgan, wait. The hired guns steered their horses smoothly to block her path before she'd crossed more than a few yards. The black carriage rolled to a slow, deliberate halt in front of her, instead, its door opening to reveal a wealthy, impeccably dressed older man, leaning heavily on a silver-tipped walking cane as he stepped down into the street. Hosea moved in front of Clementine at once, his hand resting with pointed casualness on his gun belt. Arthur Vance, he said, his voice like grinding stones. Hosea Brooks, Vance replied with a thin, unbothered smile, adjusting the fit of his gloves. I see you're still playing nursemaid to lost causes. All these years later, I'd have thought retirement might have mellowed you. His cold gray eyes shifted to Clementine, sweeping over her patched dress and dust-streaked boots with an appraisal that made her skin crawl. Miss Boo, I understand you had a rather late-night conversation with our former surveyor. You threatened him. Clementine said flatly. I educated him. Vance corrected, his tone smooth as poured oil. Morgan is an old man whose memory has grown unreliable with age. I merely reminded him this morning how dangerous it can be to perjure oneself before a federal court. dangerous for a man's freedom, and dangerous, too, for a man's family should the wrong sort of misfortune happen to find them. Clementine's hands curled into fists at her sides. That's a threat against his children. That is simply the truth of how the world works. Miss Boone, spoken plainly, which I understand is a novelty for someone your age. Vance straightened, tapping his cane once against the packed dirt. The railroad built this town from nothing but scrub and rattlesnakes. We own the tracks that feed it. We own the bank that holds every mortgage in this valley, including, I would remind you, whatever remains of your own family's debts. And we own the law that decides who keeps their land and who does not. He allowed himself the faintest, coldest smile. Take your mother and leave the valley today, while the offer to do so quietly still stands. If you walk into that courtroom again, you will lose a great deal more than a ranch. Is that what happened to my father? Clementine asked, her voice cutting through the morning air before she could stop herself. Did he lose more than a ranch? Vance, is that why a man named Silas Crow was seen in this valley the week he died? For the first time, something flickered behind Arthur Vance's composed gray eyes. Not guilty, not quite, but a kind of cold, assessing recalculation. The look of a man realizing his opponent held a card he had not accounted for. It lasted only an instant, before his practiced smile smoothed back into place. I have no idea what wild frontier gossip you've been listening to, Miss Boone, he said. Grief makes people susceptible to fanciful stories. I'd advise you to be careful which ones you choose to repeat aloud, in public, without proof. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and climbed back into his carriage. The valley is a hard place for a young woman with a wild imagination and no protector left to speak of. The Pinkertons wheeled their horses and followed the carriage away down the street, leaving Clementine standing alone in the settling dust. Her witness was gone. The testimony that could have hung Thomas Crane by his own past was dead before it had ever reached the courthouse steps. Clementine felt a wave of crushing despair threaten to buckle her knees. She turned to Hosea, whose grim expression told her he understood exactly what had just happened. They got to him, she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. We have nothing. Hosea shook his head slowly, his pale eyes narrowing in thought. Not nothing, he said. Morgan told you Crane kept that original ledger locked in his office safe. Crane used to work out of the Cornwall Operations Building, right next to the bank. Before he ever wore a black robe, Crane hasn't worked in that building for 5 years. Clementine said, exactly, Hosea replied, a dangerous glint entering his eye. When a man like Crane becomes a judge, he doesn't burn his old files behind him. A corrupt man always keeps insurance Clem records on the other men he's worked with, in case any of them ever get the notion to betray him first. If Crane forged your father's deed on Vance's direct orders, the proof of it is still sitting in that old railroad safe, gathering dust, waiting for exactly this kind of morning. Clementine looked down the street toward the Cornwall Operations Building, its windows dark, 2 armed guards already visible pacing near its front doors, even at this early hour. We can't just walk in there and ask politely. Hosea smiled faintly, a dangerous glint lighting his weathered face. Now, he said, but I still wear a silver star. Clem and a Texas Ranger can requisition private property in the course of a criminal investigation, whether Cornwall's hired guards care for the notion or not. You just need to distract those 2 men at the door long enough for me to get inside and crack that safe. 10 minutes later, Clementine walked directly up to the front doors of the Cornwall Operations Building, her chin held high, doing her best impression of a young woman who had every right in the world to be there. 2 armed guards stepped into her path immediately, rifles held loose but ready. Buildings closed to the public. Little lady, one of them grunted. A heavyset man with tobacco-stained teeth. I am Clementine Boone, she announced, deliberately pitching her voice loud enough to carry through the open windows above. I am here to accept Mr. Arthur Vance's settlement offer for my father's ranch. Go fetch whoever handles that paperwork. The guards exchanged a confused, uncertain look. This was, after all, precisely what their employers wanted the troublesome girl finally giving up, walking in of her own accord to sign away her claim. One guard hurried inside to locate the building manager, eager to be the one who reported the good news. The other stepped a few paces away from the door to light a cigarette, his rifle propped carelessly against the wall around the back of the building, in the narrow alley between the operations office and the neighboring bank. Hosea slipped through a half-latched window that hadn't been oiled or checked in years, moving with the quiet, practiced patience of a man who had spent his youth hunting outlaws through country far less forgiving than a locked office. Clementine stood on the boardwalk out front, counting seconds in her head, her heart hammering hard against her ribs. If Hosea was caught inside, he would hang for it. Silver Star or no Silver Star, trespassing on Cornwall property was one thing, but cracking a safe was quite another, and men had swung from far flimsier accusations in this territory. If she failed to hold the guard's attention even a moment too long, everything collapsed. She reached into her apron pocket and closed her fingers around her grandfather's compass, feeling its familiar, worn brass warm slowly against her palm. Hold the line, she thought. Hold the line. Inside, Hosea crept through the dim hallway into what had once been Crane's private office. Years of dust settled thick over every surface, the air heavy with stale tobacco and neglect. The heavy iron safe sat exactly where old railroad records said it would, tucked into the corner beneath a yellowed map of the valley that still bore Crane's original survey markings in his own careful hand. Hosea knelt beside it, pressing his ear against the cold iron door. He had spent decades of his life listening for the subtle click of tumblers falling into place, first hunting men who thought a locked strongbox could keep him out. Later, simply keeping the skill sharp the way a man keeps any old, useful trade alive. He spun the dial slowly, listening, feeling patient as stone. Click. Outside, the first god returned from his errand, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Vance ain't here right now," he told Clementine. "You'll have to come back later once he's back from his ride. I'll wait in the lobby." Then, Clementine said, taking a deliberate step forward. The guard put a heavy hand flat against her shoulder, stopping her cold. "I said come back later," he repeated, his tone sharpening. Clementine's mind raced for something, anything, to keep him occupied a few seconds longer. And then, suddenly, the back alley door banged open behind them, and Hosea strolled out into the street, casually dusting off the front of his coat as though he'd merely stepped out for a smoke. He walked right past both startled guards without breaking stride, and tipped his hat politely to Clementine. "Morning, Miss Boo," he said. "Beautiful day for a trial. Wouldn't you agree?" Clementine backed away from the guard's hand, and followed Hosea down the boardwalk, forcing herself not to hurry, not to look back, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run. As soon as they'd turned the corner onto the next street, safely out of sight, Hosea opened his coat. Tucked into his belt was a thick, black leather book, its cover worn smooth with years of handling. "Insurance," Hosea said quietly. Clementine took it with trembling hands and opened it right there on the boardwalk, unable to wait even the short walk back to the courthouse. The pages inside were filled with Thomas Crane's meticulous, careful handwriting, a master ledger, entry after entry, recording names, date, payoffs, and forgeries stretching back years across the entire valley. And there, on page 42, was the entry she had been searching for all along. May 12th, forged signature per Vance ledger buried. Crow retained terms as usual. Clementine stared at the ink until her vision blurred. Her breath caught hard in her throat. "We have him," she whispered. Hosea loaded his revolver with a slow, deliberate, metallic click, his face grim as a closing door. "Then let's go hang a judge," he said. "But first we need to find that clerk from the courtroom again. If there's a Crow's name written plain in Crane's own hand, that boy may know exactly where to find the rest of what we're missing." They found the sandy-haired clerk from the courtroom just after noon, in a narrow back room of the county recorder's office, where he kept the older, less used filing cabinets nobody else bothered to sort through. He startled badly at the sound of the door, one hand flying instinctively toward the drawer in front of him before he recognized Clementine's face. "Miss Boone," he breathed, relief and fear warring visibly across his features. "You shouldn't be seen here. If anyone connects us with—" "My name is Emmett Cole," he said quickly. Before she could ask, "I should have told you that this morning, but I was afraid. I'm still afraid, but I've been afraid for 2 years. Ever since I first filed a deed transfer I knew in my gut had to be false. And I've decided I would rather be afraid and honest than afraid and complicit for one more day of my life." He pulled a slim folder from beneath a false bottom in the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet, his hands not quite steady. "I've been keeping copy," he said, "of everything that crossed my desk that seemed wrong. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't have anyone I trusted enough to hand them to, until I saw you stand up in that courtroom and not back down." He held the folder out to her. "There's a payment record in there. Cornwall Railroad, dispersed through a shell account to a man named Silas Crow. paid 3 days before your father died, and again 1 week after. Clementine took the folder with hands that had gone numb. Inside, exactly as Emmett described, was a disbursement record dry, bureaucratic, utterly damning. A payment authorized by Arthur Vance's own office, routed through an account with no obvious connection to the railroad on its surface, but tracing back, line by careful line, to the very same ledger book Crane had kept locked in his old office safe. This proves Crow was paid, Clementine said slowly. But it doesn't prove what he was paid for. Now, Emmett admitted, but taken together with Crane's own ledger entry and Morgan's account of what he witnessed and the timing of your father's death against the Hargrove foreclosure, I think a federal court would find the pattern very difficult to ignore. I think a jury made up of men who've watched Cornwall swallow this valley whole, one ranch at a time, would find it very easy to believe.
Hosea studied the young clerk for a long moment, his expression unreadable.
Why risk everything to help us now? Son, you could have stayed quiet, kept your position, kept yourself safe. Emmett's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked far older than his 22 years. Because I filed the paperwork that took the Hargrove family's water rights myself, he said quietly.
I told myself it was just paper, just ink and signatures.
Nothing to do with me personally,
But I watched that family load everything they owned onto one wagon and ride out of this valley with nowhere left to go.
and I have not slept a full night since. He met Clementine's eyes.
I don't know if this can undo what happened to your father,
Miss Boone,
but it might stop it from happening to the next family in line.
Clementine closed the folder carefully,
Holding both it and Crane's master ledger against her chest like a shield.
Will you testify? She asked. Not just hand over papers in secret, but stand up in that courtroom, in front of Crane and Vance and everyone, and say what you just told me. Emmett went pale, and for a long moment, Clementine feared she had asked too much of him. Then he nodded,
Slowly, but firmly.
Tomorrow, he said, when the court reconvenes for its final session, I'll be there. Hosea clasped the young man's shoulder briefly. That's a braver thing than most grown men in this territory have managed in a decade. Son, don't forget that, whatever happens next. As they left the recorder's office and stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun, Clementine felt something shift inside her chest, not the crushing despair of the morning, when Morgan had ridden past her without stopping,
But something steadier.
something closer to the quiet certainty her grandfather must have felt riding into that impossible Shenandoah night, knowing the odds were against him,
And choosing to move forward anyway.
She had lost one witness to fear that morning, but in losing him,
She had somehow gained two things far more dangerous to Thomas Crane and Arthur Vance than any single man's testimony:
a paper trail with Crane's own handwriting on it, and a young man brave enough to stand beside her in open court and say plainly that he had seen the machine from the inside and could no longer pretend it wasn't real. Tomorrow, Hosea said, as they walked back toward the courthouse in the fading afternoon light, we finish this. Word of Arthur Vance's morning visit had traveled through Blackwater by supper time, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until half the town believed the railroad baron himself had drawn a pistol on the widow's daughter in the middle of Main Street. Clementine paid the rumors no mind. She had far more urgent things pressing on her that evening than gossip.
She and Hosea spent the hours after dusk at the ranch house,
Spreading Crane's master ledger,
Emmett's disbursement records,
and Morgan's abandoned testimony out across the kitchen table one final time, building the argument she would present in the morning piece by careful piece, the way her grandfather had once taught her to plan a march, knowing every possible turn before the first step was ever taken. Abigail moved quietly around the edges of the room, bringing coffee neither of them had asked for, saying little, though Clementine caught her mother watching the ledger more than once, with an expression that had shifted sometime in the last 2 days, from fear into something that looked almost like fierce, unwilling pride. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the first gunshot cracked through the night air outside. Hosea was on his feet instantly, revolver drawn, moving toward the window with the fluid, unhurried speed of a man who had lived through more ambushes than he could easily count.
"Get your mother down,"
he said sharply.
now. A second shot followed,
Closer this time, splintering wood somewhere near the barn. Clementine pulled Abigail down behind the heavy kitchen table, her heart slamming against her ribs, the master ledger clutched instinctively against her chest, as though it were something alive that needed shielding.
"They're not shooting at the house,"
Hosea said, peering carefully around the window frame. They're shooting at the barn. Understanding hit Clementine like cold water. The horses, she was moving before she'd fully decided to, ignoring Hosea's sharp warning behind her. Out the back door, and into the dark yard where two riders in dark dusters were working fast at the barn door, one of them holding a torch low near the dry straw pile just inside. If that barn burned, they lost not only their horses, but any chance of reaching the courthouse by morning. And worse, everyone in town would hear by dawn that fire had struck the Boone Ranch the very night before the final hearing, and precious few would believe it was any accident at all. "Get away from there," Clementine shouted, and the nearer rider spun toward her voice. Momentarily startled, the crack of Hosea's rifle split the night air a half-second later, the shot going wide and high on purpose. A warning rather than a killing shot, but it did its work. Both riders scrambled back onto their horses and bolted into the darkness. The torch dropped and stamped out hastily in the dirt before it could catch. Silence fell back over the ranch, broken only by the frightened stamping of the horses inside the barn and Clementine's own ragged breathing. Hosea reached her side moments later, rifle still raised, scanning the tree line. "You could have been killed," he said, not looking at her, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite anger. "They weren't trying to kill anyone," Clementine said, though her hands were shaking badly now that the danger had passed. "They were trying to burn us out before morning. Take away the one thing that gets us to that courthouse on time. Same difference. Out here," Hosea said grimly, finally lowering the rifle. "Vance is done playing games. That was a message, same as the note in your boarding house room, except this time it wasn't paper doing the talking. They found scorch marks on the barn door in the morning light, and a single spent cartridge in the dirt that Hosea pocketed without a word, though Clementine noticed him studying it for a long moment before he did, as though committing something about it to memory. Abigail said nothing when they came back inside, but she sat down heavily at the kitchen table beside the scattered ledgers, and for the first time in 2 months, she reached out and pulled the master ledger toward herself, turning its pages slowly by lamplight, reading her husband's stolen legacy written out in another man's careful, damning hand. "I wanted you to drop this," Abigail said quietly, not looking up. "I was so afraid of losing you the way I lost him, that I nearly asked you to let them win instead." "Mama, let me finish." Abigail's voice was steadier than Clementine had heard it in weeks. "I watched 2 men try to burn down our barn tonight rather than let a 17-year-old girl finish reading a court record. Do you understand what that tells me, Clementine? It tells me you were never the fragile one in this fight. It was always them." She closed the ledger gently and looked up, her eyes wet but clear. "Finish it, whatever it costs. Finish it for your father, and finish it so no other family in this valley has to bury someone, and then watch strangers steal what's left." Clementine crossed the kitchen and knelt beside her mother's chair, resting her head against Abigail's shoulder the way she had as a small child, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, the lamp burning low and steady between them, while outside, the last of the night slowly gave way toward the dawn that would decide everything. Courtroom 7B was suffocatingly hot by the time the final session began, packed shoulder to shoulder with ranchers, townsfolk, and railroad men, the air thick with sweat and dust and the particular electric tension of a crowd that sensed, without quite knowing why, that something enormous was about to happen in front of them. Judge Thomas Crane entered from his chambers, looking, for the first time in 3 days, thoroughly pleased with himself. He had spoken with Vance the night before. He knew Levi Morgan had fled the valley entirely rather than risk another confrontation with the Pinkertons. He believed, with the particular arrogance of a man who has gotten away with everything for a very long time, that the foolish girl at the defense table had nothing left to fight with. He did not yet know about the barn. He did not know about Emmett Cole. He did not know that his own master ledger, in his own handwriting, was sitting closed on the defense table in front of him, waiting. The bailiff called the room to order. Crane settled into his heavy leather chair with a satisfied exhale. "Proceed," he said, a cruel smile touching the corner of his mouth. Elias Reed rose instantly, smoothing his silk vest with visible relish. "Your Honor, seeing as the defense has failed to produce a single credible witness in support of its wild accusations, the Cornwall Railroad Company moves for immediate dismissal of this case. We request the court formally recognize the Boone deed as valid and binding, and that this matter be closed once and for all." Crane looked down at Clementine, and the whole town watched her along with him. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "it appears you are out of options. For the sake of the court's valuable time, do you concede?" Clementine rose slowly to her feet. She did not tremble. She did not look away from the bench. though every instinct told her to. She picked up the thick black leather ledger from the table in front of her and stepped out from behind it into the open floor of the courtroom, where every eye in the building could see her clearly. "I concede nothing, Your Honor," Reed scoffed loudly. "Objection. The girl is simply wasting the court's time now." "Overruled," Crane said, almost lazily, savoring what he still believed would be her final, humiliating collapse. "Let the child speak her final piece, and then we will be done with this circus." Clementine walked to the very center of the room, her boots loud against the worn floorboards in the sudden hush. "The plaintiff claims my father signed his land away," she began, her voice carrying clean to the back wall. "The plaintiff claims the original undertaker's ledger was simply lost through unfortunate accident. But the truth, Your Honor, is that this court has not been a place of justice for a very long time. It has been a place of business, and Judge Thomas Crane has been its most valuable employee." Crane's smile vanished entirely. "Watch your tongue, girl." Clementine raised her voice so it carried to every corner of the packed gallery. "Before you were a judge, Thomas Crane, you were the chief legal architect for the Cornwall Railroad Company. And you did not leave that position behind when you put on this black robe. You simply moved your work from an office desk to a judge's bench, where no one thought to question you." Crane's hand closed hard around his gavel. "One more word, Miss Boone, and I will hold you in contempt of this court." Clementine did not stop. She stepped forward and set the thick leather ledger down on the plaintiff's table, directly in front of Elias Reed, with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire silent room. "I submit into evidence the private financial ledger of Judge Thomas Crane, recovered this week from his former office within the Cornwall Railroad Operations Building." The courtroom froze entirely. Crane's face drained of every trace of color. He half rose from his chair, one hand gripping the edge of the bench, as though the floor beneath him had suddenly tilted. "Where did you get that?" His voice cracked on the last word, and it was not anger it was sheer, unadulterated terror. "This ledger documents more than 30 forged land deeds across this valley," Clementine said, pointing directly at him, her voice ringing clear and unshaking through the packed room. "It documents bribes paid by Arthur Vance to secure them. It documents payments made to a man named Silas Crow, dispersed 3 days before my father's death, and again 1 week after, and on page 42, in your own handwriting, Your Honor, it explicitly documents the forgery of John Boone's signature, ordered by the railroad and executed personally by you." The room exploded. Cowboys shouted from the back rows. Ranchers who had quietly lost their own land over the years stood up in open fury, years of swallowed anger suddenly finding a voice all at once. Reed scrambled backward from the ledger on the table as though it were a coiled rattlesnake, his earlier composure completely shattered. Crane slammed his gavel again and again, the sound barely audible over the roar of the crowd. "Order, order. I demand this court be cleared immediately. Bailiff, arrest that girl for contempt. Nobody touch her." Hosea Brooks's voice cut through the chaos like a rifle shot, and the room quieted just enough to hear it. He stepped through the swinging doors at the back of the courtroom, his Texas Ranger star pinned proudly to his chest, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Behind him walked 3 more men, and one of them wore the dark suit and silver badge of a United States federal marshal. Hosea had wired the territorial capital 2 nights earlier, the moment he and Clementine had cracked Crane's old safe. The marshal had ridden through the night to catch the morning train, arriving in Blackwater not an hour before court convened. The marshal walked calmly down the center aisle, past the stunned gallery, and stopped directly in front of the bench, looking up at Crane with the flat, unhurried authority of a man who had done this before, and would do it again, without losing a moment's sleep over it. "Judge Crane," he said, "you are ordered to step down immediately, pending federal review of judicial misconduct, corruption, and complicity in fraudulent land acquisition." Crane stood frozen at his bench, his mouth working without sound. He looked out over the gallery at the angry, righteous faces of men and women he had cheated quietly and legally for years, and then, finally, his eyes came to rest on Clementine. "You little fool," he spat, his voice trembling with a fury that could no longer hide the fear beneath it. "You think you can tear down the railroad? They will crush you. They will crush your mother, your ranch, this entire worthless town, and by next spring, No one will even remember your name. Clementine met his eyes, cold and perfectly steady. If I win this case, she said quietly, taking one deliberate step closer to the bench. You said you would resign? The courtroom held its breath. Resign, she said. Crane collapsed back into his leather chair as though every bone in his body had simply given out at once. He had nothing left. His secrets were laid bare in front of the entire valley, in his own handwriting, read aloud by the very girl he had mocked publicly 3 days before. The federal marshal climbed the wooden steps to the bench, pulled Crane bodily from his seat, and locked heavy iron cuffs around his wrists. For the first time in 10 years on that bench, Thomas Crane was dragged out of his own courtroom in chains, past the stunned, silent gallery, past Elias Reed frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase and sprinting for the back door before anyone thought to detain him too. Then the room erupted into deafening cheers. Hats flew into the air. Somewhere in the chaos, Emmett Cole stood quietly near the back wall, his own testimony now rendered almost unnecessary by the sheer weight of the ledger itself. Watching with an expression of profound, quiet relief, Clementine stood in the center of it all, the noise and the celebration washing over her like a wave, and looked down at her own hands. For the first time in 3 days, they were finally completely still. News of Judge Thomas Crane's arrest reached the territorial capital within 2 days, and from there it traveled east along the very railroad lines his own forged deeds had helped clear, until newspapers as far as Chicago were running the story under headlines that varied wildly in their restraint. Girl lawyer topples corrupt judge. Read one. The Blackwater scandal. Railroad empire shaken. Read another. Somewhat closer to the truth of what was actually unfolding across the valley in the weeks that followed. The federal marshal's investigation, once begun, did not stop neatly at Thomas Crane's cell door. Crane's master ledger named names far beyond his own county clerks who had accepted bribes to misfile objections, a territorial land commissioner who had personally approved dozens of Cornwall's fraudulent transfers without so much as reading them, and threaded through nearly every page in some form or another. Arthur Vance. Vance did not go quietly. He hired the finest attorneys money could still buy him, and fought the federal charges from behind the walls of his brick mansion in St. Denis for the better part of a year, insisting through every filing that he had known nothing of Crane's methods, that a regional manager could hardly be expected to oversee the particulars of every land transaction across an entire operating territory. It was Emmett Cole's careful, patient paperwork, the very disbursement records he had hidden for 2 years in a false bottom drawer, waiting for someone brave enough to need them, that eventually closed that argument for good. A payment authorized in Vance's own hand to a man named Silas Crow, timed with damning precision against John Boone's death, was not the kind of detail a careful federal prosecutor let slide past a jury. Silas Crow himself was never found. Some said he'd fled south across the border the moment word of Crane's arrest reached him. Others said quieter, darker things in low voices, at the saloon, about men like Crow, rarely surviving long once they became inconvenient to the people who had once employed them. Clementine never learned the full truth of what had happened to the man whose name had haunted her since that cold night in Levi Morgan's cabin. And in time, she made an uneasy peace with not knowing, because some doors, once you have looked long enough through the crack in them, are better left simply closed. What she did know, with total certainty, was this: her father had not died merely of a weak heart and hard years. Whether Silas Crow's hand had hastened that ending directly, or whether the stress and threats of a company determined to take his water rights by any means necessary had simply worn down a strong man's heart faster than nature alone ever would have, the result was the same. John Boone had died because he stood in the way of something powerful men wanted, and powerful men, in 1873, in a valley 300 miles from the nearest federal courthouse that mattered, had believed themselves entirely beyond consequence. They had been wrong, and the person who proved them wrong had been 17 years old. Half the ranching families in the Blackwater Valley filed their own claims in the months that followed. Armed with the same county archive records, Clementine and Hosea had first pulled together over one long, desperate night. The Hargrove family, the ones who had packed up and left 18 months before Clementine ever knew their name, were tracked down through a cousin in the county seat and informed that a federal settlement was being prepared in their favor, along with nearly a dozen other families who had quietly lost everything to the same machine over the preceding 5 years. Elias Reed was disbarred within the year, though he was never criminally charged, a fact that stung Clementine bitterly for a long time afterward, until Hosea reminded her, over coffee on the porch one autumn evening, that not every victory in this life arrives complete and clean. Some victories simply open the door wide enough for the next one to walk through more easily than the last. Arthur Vance was ultimately convicted on federal fraud charges 11 months after Crane's arrest, sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary, a sentence many in Blackwater considered far too lenient for a man who had built an empire on stolen land and quiet threats, but a sentence that nonetheless marked the first time in the valley's history that a man of his wealth and standing had answered for anything at all in a court of law. Thomas Crane, disbarred and stripped of his judgeship the very day of his arrest, pled guilty to a lesser set of charges in exchange for testimony against Vance and served 4 years before vanishing from any record Clementine ever cared to follow. And in Blackwater itself, in the small county courthouse, where a 17-year-old girl had once stood alone against 200 skeptical faces, a new judge was appointed within the month. A quiet, careful man from the county seat, who, on his very first day on the bench, made a point of personally reviewing every pending Cornwall Railroad land dispute still on the docket, one at a time, with no shortcuts and no favors, precisely because he understood exactly what kind of eyes were now watching Blackwater's courtroom from every corner of the territory. The Blackwater sun was warm on Clementine's face as she walked out of the courthouse that first afternoon, the dust of the crowd's celebration still settling in the street around her. Her mother, Abigail, was waiting by their wagon at the edge of the boardwalk, and the moment their eyes met, Abigail ran forward and pulled her daughter into a fierce, tight embrace, tears streaming freely down her weathered face. "We're keeping it," Clementine whispered into her mother's shoulder, her own voice breaking at last, now that there was finally nothing left to prove. "We're keeping the ranch, Mama," Abigail sobbed openly, holding her daughter close in the middle of the busy street. Past caring who saw, "Your papa would be so incredibly proud of you, Clement," she said, "so proud." Hosea walked out through the courthouse's double doors a few minutes later, leaning against the wooden railing, with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who had waited a very long time to see a particular kind of justice done. He lit a cigar and smiled around the smoke curling up into the bright afternoon light. "Federal Marshal says Arthur Vance is next on the list," he said. "The whole Cornwall operation in this valley is being suspended pending the investigation. Half the town's going to get their deeds back before the year is out." Clementine pulled away from her mother's embrace just enough to look at the old ranger properly. "Thank you, Hosea, for all of it." "Don't thank me, kid," Hosea chuckled, tipping his hat back on his head. "I just cracked a safe and rode fast when it mattered. You're the one who stared down the devil himself in a black robe and didn't blink. 3 days running, in front of half the territory." He took a slow pull on his cigarette. "Your grandfather would have been just as proud as your father, and Thaddeus Boone was not an easy man to impress. Believe me, I rode beside him for 30 years and only ever saw him truly astonished twice, once at Shenandoah, and once, I suspect, watching you from wherever it is old soldiers go. The day you refused that delay." Clementine reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her grandfather's brass cavalry compass, tracing the worn metal with her thumb the way she had 100 times over the past 3 days. Whenever her courage had threatened to fail her, Colonel Thaddeus Boone had carried this compass through the darkest, bloodiest night of his life, navigating 400 trapped men through impossible terrain on nothing but nerve and an unshakable sense of direction. He had always told her that true north wasn't simply a direction a needle happened to point in. It was a choice a person made before the storm ever arrived, so that when the wind and the dark finally came, there would be nothing left to decide. Only the walking. Judge Crane had looked at a grieving widow and her teenage daughter and seen easy prey, an afternoon's cruel entertainment for a packed gallery. He had mistaken their grief for weakness and their poverty for a lack of intelligence. He had made his public wager, believing that justice in this territory belonged only to men with money and influence behind them. He had never once imagined that a 17-year-old girl with a stack of borrowed law books and her grandfather's old compass would become the beginning of the end for everything he and Arthur Vance had spent years building. Clementine looked out over the sweeping golden plains stretching toward the horizon, the same land her father had bled 20 years to claim from raw wilderness. It was theirs again, free and clear, the earth beneath it as honest and unclaimed by anyone's cruelty as it had been the day John Boone first drove his stake into the ground. She turned and climbed up onto the wooden bench of their wagon, gathering the worn leather reins in her own 2 hands. She was not merely a widow's daughter anymore, and she suspected, deep in the part of herself that had grown up faster than any 17-year-old should ever have to, that she never truly would be again. Not in the way the town had once used those words, as a dismissal, a measure of how little she was expected to matter. She was the girl who had looked a federal judge in the eye in front of the entire valley, and refused to look away. And if any other greedy baron, any other Arthur Vance or Thomas Crane, ever tried to lay a hand on her family's home again, they would learn very quickly indeed that the Boone family did not break, no matter how the storm came at them, or from which direction. With a sharp, sure flick of the reins, Clementine guided the wagon out of Blackwater and pointed the horses toward home, her mother beside her, the golden light of late afternoon stretching long and warm across the valley. They had both, against every expectation, managed to keep. People in Blackwater liked to say, in the years afterward, that you could measure a person's character by where they ended up once the Cornwall Railroad's shadow finally lifted off the valley, and by that measure, the story left behind more than a few surprises. Levi Morgan never did return to Blackwater. Word reached Clementine 2 winters later, folded inside a stranger's letter forwarded through the county post office, that he had settled in a small mining town further west, under his own name, unafraid for the first time in years, and had taken in his late sister's orphan children rather than live out his remaining days alone with what he knew. He wrote only once, a short, careful note that said simply, "I should have spoken sooner. Thank you for not letting me carry it to my grave." Instead, Clementine kept that letter in the same drawer as her grandfather's old law books, and read it again every May, on the anniversary of her father's death. Emmett Cole left his position at the county recorder's office within the year, but not, as some had predicted, out of fear or disgrace. The federal prosecutor handling the Vance case had been so impressed by the young clerk's meticulous, patient record-keeping, the very habit that had once seemed like nothing more than a quiet man's timid caution, that he'd offered Emmett a position assisting the territory's new land fraud division. Emmett accepted, and spent the next decade of his life doing, openly and without fear, exactly what he had once done in secret, from a false bottom drawer, making certain no family in the territory lost their land to a lie without someone noticing. Old Ezra and the Whitfield brothers, the ranch hands who had once pooled their modest wages to buy Clementine her grandfather's law books, stayed on at the Boone Ranch for the rest of their working lives, and liked to tell newcomers passing through, with no small amount of pride and very little modesty about their own part in it, that they'd known the girl was destined for something extraordinary from the very first afternoon they'd watched her puzzle out a page of legal Latin at 12 years old, sitting cross-legged on the porch steps with her tongue between her teeth in fierce concentration. As for Hosea Brooks, he never did fully retire his silver star, though he slowed his writing considerably in the years that followed, choosing instead to spend most of his time within an easy afternoon's ride of the Boone Ranch. He was there for Sunday supper more often than not, and he was the first person Clementine sought out years later, the day she was finally sworn into practice law before the territorial courts herself, the first woman in Blackwater County ever to do so. He wept openly that day, something he later swore, with a perfectly straight face, had never once happened, and never would again. And that brings the dust to settle on our story. I share these tales hoping they offer you a quiet escape from the everyday, a little pocket of frontier justice to carry with you through whatever your own version of an ordinary evening looks like. I'm always curious how you spend this time with us. Maybe you were listening on a long drive home, washing up after supper, or sitting quiet in your favorite chair as the light goes down. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I'd also love to know which country you're tuning in from, because it still astonishes me how far these old Western tales travel, carried by nothing more than a story worth telling, and someone willing to listen. If you want to ride along for the next one, a like and a subscribe help more than you'd think, and they let me know these stories are still finding the people who need a little frontier grit and a little hope in their day. Until next time, keep your compass close, and don't ever let anyone convince you that you don't belong in the room.